Here we are. Hi, Richard.
Hi, Fred.
Absolutely fantastic day today, and I think actually it's a topic that we discussed many times, but actually Trinity has a lot of complexity. So asset management, resource management, and governance, risk, and compliance. And the next question, I think the natural question is how we are going to do all this reporting in terms of taxes, general ledger, etc. So we Trinity didn't build an accounting system, and there's a very good reason for that. And probably will be an interesting conversation today to understand what is the big difference between what is operation or the operating a company and the resources, and then the governance, risk, and compliance, and the accounting. So it's two separate things almost.
Yep. Okay, I guess the first question we would want
Hmm.
to answer is why didn't we build an accounting system
Yeah.
and just make ourselves a whole monolithic ERP platform, right? And I had an actual strategic reason for doing so,
Right.
right? I started off with the concept of CMMS,
Hmm.
right? Which was for a much smaller scale, and then continued to add features. Some of them would be considered ERP features, um, and then made the CMMS more complex in terms of its model so that it was classed as a proper EAM, entire life cycle
Right.
management from production to disposal of
Yeah.
assets. And I was challenged some time ago. Why don't I just solve it, add in the accounting?
Yeah.
Okay. It was my experience, and I'm sure it has been yours, that when you're talking about SMEs and MMEs that are at a point where they need more management, more complexity in their operations management, that kind of stuff. By
Yeah.
the time they've reached to that point, typically, and very often anyway, the one thing that's already working that they have mastered is their accounting software,
Right.
right? They have accounting software. They've learned how to do their taxes. Their people know how to post transactions. They're used to it, and they're
Yeah.
able to, generate the reports that they need to run their business. And that was one thing that everybody I ran into in terms of leads and opportunities for my product as I was growing it, none of them wanted to replace their accounting,
Right.
right? They were always asking, "Oh, do we have to switch all of our accounting?" Which is, it's its own exercise. So I decided, well, how about I add some complexity that sits on top of their accounting system,
Right.
that allows them to deal with more complex subjects than their current accounting system does. Give you a couple of for
Yeah.
instances, right? If they're using something like Xero or QuickBooks or Sage or some other cost-effective SME based subscription service.
Yeah.
Maybe one or two users are dealing with it. All right. But then they get to the point where they need more complexity for analyzing expenses in terms of their operation. They, they might want something like cost elements,
Right.
right? Cost element breakdown. Now, cost elements are basically any source of expense, and profit elements are any source of profit. And they should map to a particular general ledger account.
Right.
And what that allows you to do is instead of making a more and more complex general ledger with a whole bunch of accounts and sub accounts and sub accounts and stuff like
Yeah.
that, that starts to get unmanageable. It's better to have cost elements that are mapped to your general ledger.
Right.
And if you have those available to you, then you can break down your costs for reporting and internal management purposes without significantly altering your general ledger.
Right.
And that also allows operations people to create cost elements for their purposes, for their internal reporting, without having to go to the accounting team and ask for a new accounting code,
Right.
right? They're given an accounting code for maintenance expenses, something like that,
Yeah.
right? They can break that down into various types of maintenance expenses based on cost elements. Some
Yeah.
would be, fix on fail maintenance versus preventive maintenance versus labor versus et cetera, et cetera. They could break down their costs that way, and that gives them that complexity without having to swap out their accounting system. Now, that's not the only reason, but they come up against additional complexities. Say, for instance, they're doing a lot of materials handling, and the purchase unit of measure is different than the consumption unit of measure. Okay, so now you've got multiple units of measure
Yeah.
associated with a single stick. You buy it by the box and you consume it by the jar, something
Yeah.
along those lines, right? A lot of the smaller accounting systems, if you turn on the materials management, they don't have that. They have a single unit of measure, and you end up having to do the translation in your head or manually or something like that.
Or a spreadsheet.
It may, or spreadsheets, right? Especially if you're dealing with suppliers who have minimum order quantities
Yeah.
of a unit of measure that isn't a match to how you manage it and consume it. So
Yeah.
you don't consume certain things by the box or by the barrel.
Yeah.
It might be a chemical that you purchase by the container, which could be 20 liters, but you consume it 1 liter at a time,
Right.
right? You want to track it atomically down to every single meter, where you're using it, how you're using it, and stuff like that. But your accounting system can't handle that.
Yeah.
It'll consume things, so you're going to have to convert it to a decimal point of a barrel, right?
Yeah.
And then there might be a different purchase unit of measure than there is a stock unit of measure, right? There might be multiple purchase unit of measures depending on your suppliers.
Right.
Some might sell it, by a 25 kilo drum. Another one might only sell it in a 50 kilo drum. And you're managing that stock in terms of just a kilo,
Yeah.
right? So you want that translation to happen in terms of the unit of measure. You purchase 25 from this guy, okay, that's 1 barrel, right? 1 barrel from the other guy, that's 50,
Yeah.
right? But you want to manage all 75 and their consumption. And if you're going to do some ordering, you want to know which one, what is their minimum order quantity and their price per unit of measure in the way that you manage your stock, right?
Yeah.
This can become very important, and it can drive people nuts if their smaller accounting system can't handle unit of measure complexities.
Right.
There's some other areas. Now we add that layer, right? That's what Trinity is intended to do. Keep your accounting system, right? We add the complexity. We add cost elements.
Yeah.
We add unit of measure complexity. Also, we add various depreciation models that some accounting systems don't handle. We handle complex financial transactions like capital works
Right.
and that kind of thing that might be more difficult to manage with the smaller accounting systems. So what it is that it's a cost prevention. You don't have to replace your accounting system for one that manages operational complexity. You
Yeah.
add Trinity on top. Now, how do they integrate? Well, I never recommend automation off the bat. The way we work it, all these accounting systems have an API. You
Yeah.
basically decide with the customer what level of automation they're targeting eventually. We do it in terms of all of these systems allow you to import journal entries.
Right.
So what was important in Trinity is and you got to remember, you and I are both ex-SAP guys. We both
Yeah.
understand finance and controls. We understand the complexity of transactions, et cetera, et cetera. We understand the various stock valuation models, moving average versus fixed price versus whatever. Anyway, and I used to have an accounting designation. I used to design finance and control environments with the big blue chip platforms. So I decided to build some of that complexity into Trinity. And I make sure that all operational transactions are fully balanced, double entry accounting journal entries.
Yeah.
Right. And that means that it's very, very easy to import those into an accounting system. But I typically advise that you review those journal entries and you can do the import as often as you want, weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, whatever.
Yeah.
But once you're confident that the format and the content and the accuracy is correct, then I would start looking at automation through an
Right.
API, just automatically moving
Yeah.
the data across back and forth, right?
Yeah.
And that is far less work. Managing that integration is far less work than swapping out a whole accounting system or purchasing a monolithic ERP platform. It really
Yeah.
is. And there isn't, in terms of operational complexity, um, we are as complex as any of the biggest blue chip providers of EAM or plant maintenance or any of those kind of tools,
Yeah.
right? It's just we don't require that first you have to replace your accounting. Then you can go on and use the EAM stuff. No, no, no.
Yeah.
We allow you to use all that complexity in operations and keep your accounting system, right?
Yeah.
And we'll work together to resolve the integration. Now, some people don't want to deal with integrations, but the fact is, even when you buy a big multi-module ERP system, you're you're doing integrations anyway. It just all
Yeah.
happens to be in their platform, as opposed to keeping your original accounting
Yeah.
and adding Trinity on top of it. Now, the complexity really comes in when you start looking at multi-company, right? Now, there are certain justifications to go to a big monolithic ERP, a massive global
Yeah.
multinational and stuff like that. But up to a particular point, you don't, from a strategic management point of view, you don't need a fully consolidated, consistent, integrated general ledger at each of your entities. You don't need to swap those out. What you can do is make sure that your cost elements are consistent across the various companies that you implement Trinity on, but you can also map them to certain reporting at the group level to make sure that if there's financials that you want to track and trace against governance, risk, and compliance items, strategic drivers, that all of that can be handled quite seamlessly as well. And that's our
Yeah.
C4 product, which is
Yeah.
group reporting of multiple Trinity instances.
Right. Right.
There's other complexities that drive people into, well, we need different accounting, right? One of those would be an interesting thing that's called the lingo is called rotables treatment. Now that comes from
Right.
the aircraft industry. What a rotable is something that is in it by nature, it is a major spare part. Okay. It's not a unit of production. It doesn't qualify, but it might financially qualify as an asset.
Right.
It might not. It might be, but in every case, it's typically something that can be reconditioned, right?
Mhm.
And put back into operation. Okay.
Yeah.
There's some very clear examples of that, like an impeller shaft that needs to be rebalanced, like a pump that needs to be rebuilt.
Yeah.
Well, here's the simplest example. Say you have big heavy equipment with these huge, huge tires that are like
Yeah.
8 feet tall, right? Those are
Like
very
the mining
expensive.
trucks and that kind of stuff. Like,
Yeah, yeah, those are very
yeah.
expensive tires,
Yeah.
and they're considered assets, really, because of the expense of these tires.
Right.
Um, Meaning, from an operational perspective, you need to maintain them. You want
Yeah.
to move them out, you want to fix them, and then you want to reissue them, and you keep doing that. You retread them, right?
Yeah.
Whatever it is that you do to repair them. Now, there's various options depending on the asset. You might choose to treat them as fixed assets, which means they have a depreciation table,
Yeah.
right? That's one of the go-tos. Another one is that you don't expense it at all until it's disposed of.
Right.
Okay. And that's considered the default method, is that you wouldn't show any financial transaction. But another one has come along that has been argued in tax authorities, and it's been the result of legal cases and stuff
Yeah.
like that. It's called the optional method.
Right.
And what ends up happening is you declare an expense when you issue the major spare, right?
Right.
And say something goes wrong with it and it needs to be rebuilt, reconditioned, repaired. you take it away from its installation location, you have to do a declaration of revenue,
Right.
right? More as a contra expense, but then it's going into stock, but it's not available stock.
Mm.
And then you repair it. Okay. Now, instead of just declaring that as an expense, the repair cost,
Yeah.
you add to the value. So you have to declare that revenue value as what's its fair market value
Yeah.
when it's not something that's going to be disposed. So used things that need a small repair aren't worth zero,
Yeah.
right? They're worth something. So you want to be able to declare how much is it worth, really, when you bring it back into stock, and you've got to
Right.
give it a fair market value. Then you recondition it, and that's a rebuild order.
Yeah.
And what it does is it takes the expense of the rebuild, adds it to its part value,
Right.
and it goes back into stock, right? Now that is a rebuild. That's a rebuild
Yeah.
part. And when you issue it the next time, you declare it as an expense again. That's
Right.
called the optional method for rotable, for rotating
Yeah.
assets or rotable stock or major spares, that kind of stuff. If you have those kinds of things in your business and your accounting system can't manage the transaction, or you don't have an EAM platform that has that capability for dealing with rotables, you end up sometimes with a disadvantaged strategy because you've got no choice. Now,
Right.
as you can imagine, there can be an impact on your profit and loss
Yeah. Yeah.
when you expense an expensive spare part,
Yeah.
right? Versus having zero expense shown until you dispose of it,
Right. Right.
right? And some people want to make that choice. Say you've got a diamond drill bit that's worth a heck of a lot. There's many examples, but it's
Yeah.
basically major spares that are not units of production. They have to be installed to be of any business value, and they're of significant worth. They can be reconditioned and put back into production, that
Yeah.
kind of stuff. And companies want a choice of how to deal with that financially.
Right.
If your materials management and your EAM platform can't handle both the financial transactions of the optional method and can't handle the rebuild
Yeah.
transaction, um, you know, you're really severely limited in terms of what the customer is able to do. Now, in some
Right.
countries, that optional method isn't even legal. In other ones, it's been argued and it's become, the standard for
Yeah.
dealing with major spares. But this is just one example of advanced operational transactions
Yeah.
that Trinity can handle and give that complexity to a company that's using a very simple implementation of Xero,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Or QuickBooks or Sage or any one of a dozen other
Yeah.
simpler accounting systems. So multiple units of measure. Um, Now you've got like rotables treatments. You've got the concept of capital works.
Yeah.
You've got various methods of dealing with labor costs, trade rates, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes you want them as accruals because you plan on paying people an hourly rate based on the
Yeah.
work they've done in the platform.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you might just want to be tracking it in terms of resource utilization. You're paying them a salary, right? But you want to record how much of that salary expense has been consumed by maintenance activity, actual
Right.
scheduled
Right.
activity, that kind of stuff. So it's not a financial transaction, but it is a operational transaction that
Operational.
you want to
Yeah.
keep. Yeah, you want to keep track of that number. And because of the cost element layer, you can make the consumption of resources as complex as your business requires.
Yeah.
That's one of my favorite sayings with regards to Trinity is it's as simple as you want,
Yeah.
and yet it can be as complex as you need.
Right. Right.
Right? You don't have to deal with all that complexity if you don't want. You turn things off and you hide things and you make it
Yeah.
nice and simple. But if you need that complexity, it won't drive you to the monolithic ERP,
Right.
you know, and hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars, right? There's a whole scope between I have an accounting system and I'm running everything else off spreadsheets and monolithic traditional ERP systems. There's a
Yeah.
whole range in there that is unaddressed. That's what we built it for,
Right,
right?
right, right.
Now, if they purposely want to consolidate all of their financing controls, by all means, go with a monolithic ERP.
Yeah.
I personally don't think the juice is worth the squeeze. Um, but if you want an alternative, then you go with
Yeah.
something like Trinity.
I'm
Yeah.
I'm thinking I'm thinking also the thing that you mentioned it actually are very, very interesting from I think the three portions. The one is that you mentioned that Trinity can handle all these things actually are very, very specific for certain industries and companies
Hmm.
that the current accounting system are not prepared for because accounting system pretty much are standardized practices. Just put it together. So then
That's
then you
that's
have
right.
to, yeah. So then that's when the kind of Frankenstein ledgers start to happen and coding and it start to get so complex at the end you need a specialist just to understand your own company and also adding a layer of risk, if you may, that actually this is in the head of somebody, even if it's not a spreadsheet and everything is documented, is so personalized, if you may, with so many coding that actually at the end is a lab is a maze, your own accounting system.
Yeah.
But with Trinity, you have all that very clear specified to the point that actually the company wants to know the detail. And that brings me to the second point, actually, is highly traceable, what's going on, uh, ready prepared for audits. And if it's a requirement, then you can do reporting because you mentioned something about the capacity to extract this information. And so then all the dashboard reporting into the granular deep dive of where our expenses are coming from or which areas are going on. You don't need to make a magician trick in the accounting system to get that information. If you operate correctly from Trinity, you can get all that from Trinity instead of putting an extra effort and stress on the accounting team or the CFO's office to do all these
Yeah.
things. And the third layer that I'm thinking actually how it can help a company is on compliance because
Oh, yeah.
and, and probably that's a whole conversation how this is going to help to say for example supply chain so how people you mentioned
Well,
labor you mentioned
here's a few
training you mean
simple
yeah
transactions. Here's a few simple ones
yeah
that are prone to governance risk.
right
Okay.
right
That we've addressed and we've
mm,
added them in. That's why I say that we're also the best of ERP,
yeah
right? People facing processes that typical accounting systems don't manage, that they want that governance in there. They
yeah
have to report on their on the governance and the risks associated and the
yeah
policies and the procedures and the workflows, et cetera, et cetera. So one would be just the way they deal with
right
expense claims, personal expense claims,
yeah
according to a policy, et cetera. We have expense claims. The transactions get
yeah
generated in Trinity and then they can be moved to your accounting. We have a
right
full customizable workflow for expense claims.
right
Another one would be petty cash management,
yeah
multiple petty cash funds and how they get dealt with, right? Basically, all of your expenditures should be in a few different levels. One would be beyond a certain value, everything has to be purchased through a supplier,
right
through an approved supplier, through a purchase request, an approved
yeah
purchase order, right?
yeah
And then you've got the petty cash stuff, right? And those are smaller purchases. You don't purchase spare parts with petty cash.
right
It's just for incidental expenses and stuff like that that are not driven by the individual. And then you've got the expense claims by the individual. Now,
yeah
at each layer, you have a policy, right?
yeah
That, you know, purchase orders required for these kind of purchases. Petty cash is used for this scope of things. Expense claims, here's our policy. Not
right
only that, corporate gifting.
right
That's a very important one. What about the What about giving or receiving benefit of any kind of
Yeah.
benefit to to business contacts, that kind of stuff?
Yeah.
That's another governance process that can have a transaction. You might be spending the money. It should be company money. What? It's not supposed to be out of your pocket, right?
Right.
It
Right.
might be part of an expense claim, but depending on your workflow for gifting, you might require approval to provide any kind of gifting to somebody.
Yeah.
You might require approval prior to receiving any gift from, especially if it's a supplier,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
You do not want to give the appearance, if you're a purchase approval, um, of giving favorable terms
Yeah.
to a supplier, and also showing that you've gotten, you're receiving gifts from them.
Yeah.
So every company is going to have their own policy, but when they get to that stage where they want all of that governance, that risk, they want that management, that compliance, they typically start thinking, okay, my accounting system doesn't handle that. Now we need all these manual systems, add-on siloed platforms, et cetera, et
Yeah.
cetera. No, no, just check a box, turn it on, and Trinity will handle it for you.
Right. Right.
Figure out your process, figure out your policy. We have policy management in Trinity where people have to accept the policies in order to execute transactions
Yeah.
related to the module. So if you determine that your expense claims are policy driven, we record when somebody reviews a policy that you've
Yeah.
published and has accepted the policy. If they
Right.
haven't, they can't do an expense claim.
Right.
Cool, right?
Right.
You just tick a box to choose that. Here's another thing. A lot of people understand something like uh, statements of authority. Bob
Oh
can
yeah.
approve a purchase under 5,000. Above that, you know,
Yeah.
Becky can approve anything between 5 and 10,000. Those statements of authority exist in Trinity, just like in any kind of workflow driven request and approval
Yeah.
process. And our workflow engine applies to about, I don't know, 15 different business objects.
Yeah.
Some of them are financial, some of them are not. But then there's another concept that a lot of people don't think about that is pure compliance, and it's called segregation of duties,
All right. Yeah.
right? Segregation of duties is about, even if I have the privilege, because the value is within my approval limits,
Yeah.
if I'm the requester, I cannot approve it. So I
Right.
can't approve my own expense claim. It's segregation of duties, right?
Yeah.
That's a compliance thing, so that somebody isn't going out and uh, buying bottle service, and doing an expense claim for it and approving their own expense because
Yeah.
it's within their limits to do so, right? And a lot of systems, sometimes it's tied into your line manager approving everything, right?
Yeah.
And other times there is no enforcement, right? It could be a policy, but there's no actual enforcement from the
Right.
system perspective. And I was in a situation, previous company, previous life, with particular, monolithic ERP accounting systems
Yeah.
where there was a breach and a temporary loss of a business license. And in order to solve the problem, we had to be able to prove that the system would not allow a breach of segregation of duties. Oh
Right.
boy, that's not easy to do. And you can write all the policies you want, get everybody to agree to them.
Yeah.
But in that case, the authority didn't want it to be possible for that guy to click the approve button,
Right.
right? Anyway, I won't get further into that story, but the point is, I just built it in. Every single workflow at every single stage has got an owner of an object, right? You're either the owner or, it gets passed on to someone else when you
Mm-hmm.
submit it for approval. And if I'm the owner, I can't be the approver. I'm the submitter, right?
Right.
That's if the box is checked. I might want to be able to approve my own work orders. I
Yeah.
created a work order, and the process is it goes from a draft to an active work order. I'm allowed to approve that. So you
Yeah.
wouldn't tick the box, segregation of duties. But it might be that it is a purchase order. It might be that it's an expense claim. It might be that it's a petty cash
Yeah.
voucher. It might be that it's gifting. something along those lines. And it doesn't matter what my statement of authority privileges are.
Yeah.
If the SOD box is ticked in that workflow, I can't approve it come hell or high water. It's just
Right.
not going to let me. That button won't even appear for me
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
it's my request.
Right. Right. Right.
Right? Now
Right.
you can't fix all people problems. One of the typical ways that this gets gamed is that a boss tells his employee to
All right.
submit an expense, right? But that
We are
gets
not giving
overcome with
ideas, by the way. It's just it's
It's
pure
just common
observation of
stuff.
the of behavior.
Yeah, because I got asked. I'm not accusing everybody of doing this. I'm just
Yeah.
saying
Yeah.
that it's a compliance breach and it's a concern, but
Yeah.
it's a people problem, and that has to be people problems can't be always solved with systems,
Yeah.
right?
No.
People problems sometimes need to be solved with written in stone policies that they've accepted. Typically the policy for something like that is when it comes to expenses, right? Like travel and entertainment,
Yeah.
um, spend out in public, that kind of stuff, is that the most senior person at the table has to be the one to submit. They can't have an underling submit it on their behalf,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And if they don't want it on their expense claim, then don't show up. But
Yeah.
basically, it comes down to that is it's a policy that controls that potential gaming of the system. Beyond that, that guy would submit it, and then somebody else has to approve it if you've got SOD turned on. And that's the
Yeah.
way you get around having my line manager approve it. He told me to submit these expenses. No, that's partially a people
But
problem,
then,
partially a
yeah,
compliance issue. Yeah.
but then is a clear violation of first the policies, the company policies, and secondly, is a questionable ethics there. Like, what are you doing?
Oh,
Really?
it's
Yeah.
if you've put
So
out the
we don't
policy.
encourage that at all.
Oh, no, 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 no. It's not encouraging. It's recognizing how
Mm.
workflow
Yeah.
can't solve every problem.
Yeah.
Sometimes you need a policy, right? And
Yeah.
policies don't control people, but it gives you very, very clear rules
Yes.
around what's a breach and what's not. And if they've
Yeah.
accepted that policy and you have a record of it, you've got grounds for dismissal if they go and ask somebody else to submit
Yeah.
their expenses on their
There
behalf,
you are. Yeah.
right? Right.
There you
I'm
are.
not encouraging that practice. I'm saying I've run into it. I've run into it 100 times at least in the last 30 years where somebody wanted a system to make sure that can't happen. And it's impossible, right?
Yeah.
To manage it with a workflow. You can only manage that at policy because workflows can't solve people problems. That's a
Yeah.
clear ethical breach, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, but those kind of complexities, what can be controlled by workflow and by a system,
Yeah.
it is controlled, right?
Right.
And the customer gets to decide how complex their workflow is,
Yeah.
right? With all of these various business
Yeah.
processes. If they want it nice and simple, it stays simple, right? Work orders may not even require an approval. They just go from draft to active. That's it,
Yeah.
and then to closed.
Yeah.
Um, it might be that certain work orders, if they include any changes or configurations to an asset, require engineering approval.
Right.
I've seen complex processes for work orders where first it's got to go to the operational guy to approve that the work needs to be done. Then it goes to accounting to approve if we can afford the work. Then it goes to engineering to approve whether or not the work should be done at all.
Right.
And then it goes into being an active work order.
Right.
And we've accommodated
Yeah.
unlimited complexity, but you can keep it as simple as you want. Yeah.
Yeah. So excellent. So back to accounting. So that's
Yeah.
why Trinity didn't build an accounting uh, system, because actually that's not needed really, because the companies
Most
already have.
times.
Yeah. Most. Yeah. Probably most.
The
Yeah.
problem is that the complexities pile up, the
Yeah.
compliance, the governance, the risk. Now you got multiple small entities to manage. It all starts to add up. And what a lot of people are led to do is let's put in a big monolithic ERP system
Yeah.
and let's let that implementation determine our new processes.
Yeah.
The problem is they think that the implementation is going to help them come up with standard processes across
Yeah.
the board. The fact is, those companies show up and ask you what you want it to do. They're not going to give you the best processes for your business. I have standard workflows for everything, but the point is, it's a sledgehammer to hammer in a very small nail, right?
Yeah.
Is okay, we'll go through all that to consolidate everything so that we're seeing a consolidated picture. It's just, it's total overkill. It's not necessary. Your
Yeah.
accounting is
Yeah.
likely working just fine. If you're not
Yeah.
being indicted, then everybody's following the rules in market for accounting, for reports, for
Yeah.
tax compliancy, right? It's just when you get to a level of complexity, there's more operational workflows that you need to accommodate, or there's top level governance, risk, and compliance that you
Yeah.
want to address. And look, I would rather take some accounting data and import it into Trinity as accounting metrics,
Right.
right? That are strictly accounting. All your operational metrics are coming from Trinity, right? Those are natively built in.
Yeah.
Some figures you might need from your accounting system. And that's just one small import of data once a
Yeah.
month kind of thing, right? Versus swapping out everything that
Yeah.
works before
Yeah.
you ever have any hope of getting to the end point. And, a lot of these cases, you're talking about 6 months to a year before you even get to see one report.
Yes. No, it's for an SME or an MME that's too long. It's too much because they are more agile. They are more on the day to day with their
Yeah.
own
So
complexities.
until
Anyway.
until they hit, they have the pain, but until they hit a certain scale
Hmm.
where $1 million implementation and license fees and rollout and all that other kind, until they hit that scale where that's not going to completely consume all of their, net profit,
Yeah.
um, they're left with very little choice
Yeah.
to manage those complexities. I saw that as a challenge. I saw that as a gap. I saw that as something that I feel driven to solve. It's a technology problem. It is not any other kind of a problem,
Yeah.
right? So let's put out a technology solution as an
Right.
alternative for the companies that are stuck in the gap. And there's a lot of companies stuck in the gap.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fantastic. I think that we can wrap up here because actually this is very, very helpful to understand that actually companies don't need to change their accounting systems. They
Nope.
That's pretty much, and I think that is one of the biggest concerns. Do I need to change everything now? No, you don't have to.
No, you
Just
don't.
implement
You're going to end up
Trinity and
you're
you're
going to
good.
end up doing some mapping and consolidating
Right.
if you're multi-company, but you
Yeah.
got to do that whether you're on a monolithic ERP or not. You got to do that anyway. You're doing it manually right now,
Yeah.
right? We help you map it once and then you're good to go.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you, Richard. Until next week then.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Frank.
Bye-bye.
Bye.